You know, normally when I'm talking about my research, the storytelling is in fact what my research area is. And I present it to academics all the time, of course, and you know, you have to worry about your Cronbach alpha and your T statistics and your, you know, your statistical significance, and a lot of things that really aren't all that exciting. So to get an opportunity to talk to some people who are going to understand this more at a gut, practical level, I jumped at the chance, and I really am glad to be here today to get to speak to you about my research, and hopefully you'll go away with some ideas that not only help you in your professional life, but your personal life too. And the first thing Jane asked me is, well, what do you want me to put down as the title of the story? And so I boarded something out. And I don't think it has anything to do with what we're going to talk about today, but it has personal significance. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. My dad was drafted into the Army, excuse me, during the Korean War, and fortunately got sent to Austria, which was kind of a cushy place compared to Korea. And what he said was the common thing around there in the military was, now look, if you get in trouble, the thing you do is don't change your story. Because if you change your story, they know you're lying, right? And it's all over with. So no matter how implausible the original thing you blurt out is, stick with it to the bitter end. You know, they may still get you, but at least you've got a chance. So 5,000 times during my life, I've heard my dad say, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. You know, mostly in jest when he says that. But so it has personal significance. We'll find out if it has any more than that. Now, how I got started down this road, now you've already heard I left industry and went back to get a PhD degree. I was early on in that process when, in a meeting not entirely dissimilar to this one, we call them brown bags in academia. We bring out peanut butter jelly sandwiches, and the faculty member or graduate student gives a presentation to the other faculty and grad students. So I was in one of those, and Lee Manzer, a guy who'd been around Oklahoma State for 30-some years, had told me at one time he had taught 20,000 students principles of marketing. I don't know if that's a record, but it's a darn good average. And they have 5 to 10 times. We're very fortunate in our principles class. We have about 30 students. They have 5 to 10 times that many. So he was really churning through them. And another thing he did as a clinical professor was he would go out and speak to groups like this. He would interface with companies and give speeches. One of his speeches happened to be on storytelling, mostly as used by managers, not salespeople, but storytelling as used in leadership, change management, that sort of stuff. So he gave that presentation one day in a brown bag, and I was there. And I went back to, I'd call it a cubicle, but it was really 3 boards bolted to a wall with a broken chair in front of it. You learn real quick how they feel about grad students once you get to grad school. Jane treats me much better, I appreciate it. But I got back, boy, storytelling in sales, there's got to be a lot of literature on that. And I don't know if you are familiar with academic literature. A lot of people go all the way through and get their degree and leave college and never realize what we as faculty members do. We have to produce research, and we have to get it published in what are called peer-reviewed journals. Now, one you're probably familiar with would be the New England Journal of Medicine. Tonight on the news, you'll probably hear that salt is either very good for you or very bad for you, depending on which way they feel about it this week. And that was published in a peer-reviewed journal like the New England Journal of Medicine. Well, there are probably 50 to 100 pure marketing journals, and there are at least 500 that will accept marketing paper. So there's an astonishing number of journals you have never heard about and never will. So this is where I went searching for this academic, scholarly research, scientific inquiry into storytelling in sales. To my astonishment, there wasn't a single article. Still, to this day, 5 years later, I've never found one on storytelling in sales. To me, it was a natural connection. I'm like, hey, there's a giant gap in the literature. A dissertation topic has just fallen into my lap. And so I immediately started to research that and ended up writing a dissertation on it. First thing I ran into was, as I looked through the humanities and psychology and all other types of literature, was something that you won't find surprising. That stories are everywhere. We just tell them constantly. I've run out of synonyms for ubiquity in writing about storytelling. Just, there's only so many ways you can say they're very common, they're everywhere, we tell them all the time, they're ubiquitous, and on and on. And in your own experience, I'm sure that doesn't strike you as being surprising. we as human beings, you can kind of imagine some early humans sitting around a campfire. One says, me kill great buffalo with strong arm today, feed whole tribe. And his friend who was there with him says, you tripped on a rock and accidentally speared that buffalo. And that's when laughter was created, right there. And that was the first joke. And so we can, if you've ever been camping yourself, you can imagine how much we must have sat around and communicated this way. And this is before writing. It's telling each other stories about what do you do in the wintertime, and you're kind of like the matriarch elephant that leads the herd to water in dry times. That the older people of the tribe had to communicate survival information. They largely did it through stories. We've been telling stories since before history. Once we got to history, I've never traveled, I've never been fortunate enough to travel in the ancient parts of the world where you'll find these big obelisks. See, I've seen them on TV. Maybe some of you have been lucky enough to see them in person. And I can kind of imagine the guy carving the story on the obelisk, you know, great leader won battle today against the Assyrians. He's carving these pictures in there. And then they raise it up, and now the story is 40 feet in the air. It just seems a horribly impractical way to do it, but they continue. We did the same thing with the pyramids. Made all these beautiful stories on the walls of the pyramids and then sealed the pyramids. Cave paintings in ancient France, their stories, 20, 30,000 years ago. Not a practical form of communication either. We're doing much better now that since we invented papyrus and paper. It really got rolling after that, right? Think about your religious experiences. No matter what persuasion you're in, it doesn't matter if you read the Quran, you're Buddhist, you read Jesus, you read the Old Testament. Parables, stories abound. It's practically how religion is taught. Stories is practically how religion is taught. We just, and most of you are probably like me, very glad the political season's over. But think about, somebody name for me right quick, the greatest storytelling politician of your lifetime. Who would it be?
Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, it's immediate, right? You just know immediately. And he's called the great communicator. Because, right? If you think back a little bit, you think about guys like Roosevelt, maybe Churchill, also great storytellers. In politics, if you can tell a story, you're already a leg up on the competition. The entertainment industry, since I've been looking at this, I've just been struck. Almost all of our entertainment industry, we talk about writing books, songs, movies, it's about story. Obviously, plays have been around since antiquity as a form of entertainment. Shakespeare, the Greeks. I remember when I was in Stillwater and I was beginning to investigate stories, we had a little concert come down. It was one pretty well-established country singer. He had an album or two out, and one guy was just trying to get started. It warmed him up, right? So the warm-up guy, you know, his songs were kind of repetitive. He'd have some little theme or something. But the guy who had made it, the guy who was actually succeeding in getting his music out there on the radio, told stories. He could tell complete stories. And that was kind of the difference between an amateur musician and somebody that really, especially in country music. Sometimes rock and roll, I'm not so sure what they're talking about. In country music, you've got to tell a story if you want to be a success. And so that's the first thing I ran into. I'm like, man, stories are everywhere. How do we begin to, one of the big jobs is just parsing this out and trying to make sense of stories. So let's talk about some of the literature that's available in humanities, psychology, sociology, and management and marketing have looked at it some too. One of the things we have to deal with in academia is definitions. Now, somebody give me a definition for a table. Who wants to be a volunteer to define a table?
A platform that you use, I guess, for anything. Platform that you use for eating or writing or...
Functional definition. Okay. What about if I take that table you described, and I take it up on the space station, and I try and use that there? Is it no longer a table because nothing will set on it? If I have a table, maybe if I try to instead of doing it functionally, let's describe it physically. It has 4 legs, a flat horizontal surface approximately 2.5 feet from the floor. Well, then is what the thing that the Japanese kneel by or sit by on the cross-legged and eat is that a table? How about one with 1 leg? Would that be a table? So even though we have something that's very physical, we can measure it, we can look at it, we can test it, we can build one, touch it, it's very hard to actually define, have a satisfactory universal definition of something that simple. So when we think about things like job satisfaction or work-family conflict that we as academics try and deal with, trying to define those things we call constructs that are really just ideas in our head, they really have no physical form, this is extraordinarily difficult. So when I started to define storytelling in a way that satisfied academics, that I had a measurable, universal construct definition for storytelling, I had a lot of flaming darts thrown at me, I can tell you, by other academics. This is not measurable, this is not really what stories is, it doesn't cover this case, doesn't. So it's extraordinarily difficult. So rather than argue with you, I'm just going to find out what your definition of storytelling is. Somebody tell us what. If I say to you, not you, how about you? Here's a volunteer right here. If I, she's got a mouthful, that's fair enough. If I said to you, I told somebody a story this morning, what does that bring into mind? How would you define a story?
Yeah, a series of events that probably compel some sort of emotion.
Oh, you must have been cheating. Did you work on this earlier this morning? That's pretty good. I mean, because you got the word events in there. We're talking about events, right? Things that happened in the past. Or, interestingly enough, things that could happen in the future, right? So a story is a discourse dealing with interrelated actions and consequences in chronological order. Or we could use the word events in chronological order. Why chronological order, though? Do you feel like you're back in marketing class? Why does that matter?
For context.
You could totally lose the thread, right? Because it's all about causality. The power of stories comes from causality, and a big part of that is sequentiality. You know very well that if I say to you, oh, my cat died this morning, I think it's that meteor shower that's due next week that killed it. You'd be quite certain I was completely daft, right? Because you know something's going to happen next week can't cause anything that's happening this week. They might have a common cause that happened last week, but you cannot have a cause like that. So the power of stories is causality. I can tell from them, this happened, and this happened, and this happened. And I infer from that this caused this. And so probably if I run into that same situation next month, and I see this happening, I can think, oh, okay, I know what's going to happen next. And that's the power of stories as we pass them along through generations, or we use them in politics or religion. They have this ability to show us how the world works, its causality, the answers the why questions that we have about our world around us. There's a story grammar. Who's got a 3-year-old child or grandchild at home? Do you have one? Now, if you go home tonight and you tell them a story, will they be able to understand that's a story and be able to follow along and understand how it goes? If something happened to them today, they went to the zoo or something, could they tell you that story tonight? What happened?
It's not as clear, but yeah.
By about 3 years of age, a typical human being begins to understand story grammar. So this has led a lot of psychologists to believe that we as humans are hardwired to tell, understand, and consequently maybe to believe. Some psychologists say our truth meter is set to believe on stories. When we hear a story, we say, unless we have a good reason to believe it's false, we just assume the story is true. If the story seems plausible, if the teller has a good reason to lie, we believe it's true. So we use these stories because of this causality, because we find them believable, to make frameworks about the world around us, to understand how our world works. We start that from 2 or 3 years of age. We don't quit until we die, using stories to understand our world and form frameworks about it. I early on in my career, I was at a customer's place in Columbus, Ohio. And I had a problem with a piece of machinery there, and I couldn't fix it. So I thought, well, I'll do what I usually do. Being a greenhorn, I usually had to call people for help anyway, so I started calling. So I called one person. Nope, never saw that. Another. By the time I'd run through the top 4 or 5 most experienced people in the company, tracking them down all over the United States and getting them on the phone, which wasn't near as easy back then as it is today. No one had ever seen it. I talked to people with 100 years of experience, and no one had ever seen this problem before. I kind of had an epiphany that day. I said, if you're going to be a success in this career, you've got to be able to fix stuff you've never seen before, because otherwise you're never going to get anywhere. the point is that through stories, it allows us to get outside of my little bit of experience, and I can learn vicariously. Even at the end of my career, after 20 years in that trade, it amazed me how often, literally every day, I'd walk into a shop and I'd say, I never saw that before. I've never seen a printing press do this. I don't know why this press is doing this to you. Even after that much experience. And so if we didn't have stories and the ability to learn, maybe some of you work in a sales department, or you work in a service department, or you have a service department. What's the first thing people in those trades do when they get together? They start swapping stories, right? Oh, I had this happen to me. Oh, yeah, and here's how I fixed it. And I remember that from my days in the service department. Hundreds of guys would get together for service meetings, and they would start swapping stories. So this ability to learn vicariously. We do it as children. We learn from our peers, from our siblings, from our parents, from our grandparents. We learn about the world around us. Other parts of story grammar include omission. I leave out a lot of stuff. The more background knowledge you and I share, the more I can leave out a story. I don't have to explain who my uncle is if you know my uncle, etc. Right? Implication and inference are important parts of story grammar. What about embellishment? That's kind of the opposite of omission, right? I had a grandfather, a step-grandfather. My grandfather died before I was born, but my step-grandfather was kind of a character, to be honest with you. But I loved him. And I think a big part of that reason was he was a storyteller. How many of the characters, those people you think of as being characters, are also big storytellers? That's pretty common too, right? I had a guy that was in business with my dad. My dad was a young man. Briefly, they were in business together, and we became such good friends that we ended up calling him Uncle Bert once those kids came along. And he was a raconteur. He was a storyteller and a laugher. And those kind of people, maybe you can think back in your family, maybe you had a grandfather, an uncle, or somebody, a neighbor, who was that kind of a person. And you just have that emotional connection with that kind of a person who's that big storyteller. And even if they tell what we would call whoppers, sometimes it's still endearing that they do this. Turn taking is an interesting example of story grammar. Right now, we're in a very specific social setting where I'm speechifying, and that normal turn taking that Harvey Sachs, the sociologist, talked about, you say something, and that reminds me of something, and you say something. That is suspended during speechifying. It's also suspended during storytelling, right? You can interject something like, oh, no, wait a minute, was it Bob that took you to the airport? Or you can say, no. Oh, wait a minute, I already know that part. Go ahead, get to the end, get to the interesting part. You can interject something, but you've got to shut up then and let them continue. Your turn is suspended again until the end. One of the things that kind of caught me by surprise when I started looking at story grammar was tense. Now, what do you think, what tense of the English language do you think most stories are told in? The past, right? Until the year 1300, history and story were basically synonymous in European languages. And only after that did they start to diverge. History or the past, that's what the fodder of stories is. Our photographer could get on the phone and describe to somebody what is going on in this room right now, and he would be telling a story in the present tense. The stories in the present tense are pretty unusual. What surprised me is how often we tell stories in the future tense. I'm not talking about Star Trek. Star Trek is a story set in the future, but it's told as though it happened in the past, right? So it's actually a past tense story, Star Trek. But what I'm talking about is as I'm saying to you, if you install our new Model 6000, you'll improve throughput 30%, and you can close your plant up at Batesville and increase profits by $1 million next year. That's a story full of causality, told about the future, and you can see how powerful that kind of story can be in a sales set. And so I think that's one of the things that surprised me. I really didn't think about telling stories in future tense. If you just asked me that quick, I'd probably say you can't tell a story in future tense, right? But certainly you can. Let me give you just an example of a story, maybe help you a little get your head around more. What these are not novels, right? We don't sit and tell novels to each other. Oh yeah, around maybe thousands of years ago when the camp elders were telling their sagas, yeah, you'd sit there for 3 hours and listen to a story. We don't do that anymore, right? We tell very, very terse, or what I would call minimal, stories to each other in our daily encounters and in the sales setting and in personal interchange. Let's try, now we've kind of defined what a story is, let's see if we can classify one. How about the king died and then the queen died? Would that qualify as a story? I think most people would infer that there was something about the king's death that caused the queen to die, but it really doesn't say that. If I say the queen died and then the king died and then the queen died of grief, now I've linked it. It's definitely causal. I know there's a story here, right? The beginning, Aristotle wrote the Poetics 2,000 years ago. We still use it today. Beginning, middle, and end of stories. That story has the beginning state, the king and queen were obviously alive. The middle process, the king died, and then the ending process, the queen died also. There was a causal process there that went through. So that's a very, very short story, one sentence. Right? Would you have thought you could tell a story in one sentence? Well, you can. You do it every day, in fact. An example of a sales story is our company had fallen behind the competition in digital controls for milling machines. But 2 years ago, we built a new electronics factory. Because of this, our Nebula line of controllers is the best on the market. And that's absolutely a beginning, middle, and end, full-fledged causal story, 3 sentences long. The Nebula line of controllers is built in our new electronics factory. Would that qualify as a story? Probably not. That's just a statement of fact. It's a statement, exactly. It's part of what we would use arguments. We use arguments, kind of one of the contrary things in sales to telling somebody a story about a product success or the founding of your company or something, is arguments. We got this feature, we got this benefit, we got this feature. Does that sound familiar? And so the conclusion is this is definitely going to fulfill your needs. Right? That's kind of, so that last sentence there is really more of that kind of thing, an element of an argument. Psychology. So why does that work better? Why does a story work better than an argument? Psychologists think it's because of the difference between narrative and analytical processing. Narrative processing obviously has to do with storytelling, right? Analytical processing is more like a logico-scientific kind of a, what you would think of a syllogism from your logic class, which you fell asleep in probably like I did. This, again, and this, implies that this conclusion must necessarily be true. The problem with those kind of things is if one argument is false, what about the conclusion? It doesn't follow, right? The conclusion, if just one of those things I said is not true, you don't believe it, then the conclusion is unnecessarily suspect. We don't do that with stories. Stories, we believe, we analyze through this narrative type of processing that says, okay, maybe this part of the story doesn't sound that implausible, but I don't discard the whole thing because of it. I still find the rest of the story, the conclusion, if you will, the gist of the story, to be believable. And I'll use it then in frameworks that I think about. I use those to do things like form opinions of you, other views, and self-views of myself, self-image. We do that through stories and storytelling. I think what I would have told Toyota when they were having all those problems with cars and driving people off the cliffs a few years ago, I would have said, put this in a story. Stories take the world as it is, all of its uncertainty, all of its blemishes, all the things we don't know or can't know, and we take a plausible whole away from that. We take the part that says, yeah, I can work with this, and we use that. And so Toyota should have cast that in light of no car is perfect, ours isn't either. But we are a company dedicated to keeping you safe in your automobile. That's the kind of a story. If their advertisement tended a little bit towards more arguments. We're doing this, we're doing that, we're doing this. Therefore, you should trust Toyota to be a safe car. And that was not, I think, as compelling of a sales pitch as if they had set that more in a story. They didn't ask me for it. Another interesting thing that psychologists told is memory. Shank and Abelson, some very famous guys from Yale, psychologists who did some artificial intelligence type of work, and they came to the conclusion that essentially memory equals story. Now, not every psychologist has gone that far and really buys that argument, but I think you can kind of imagine just thinking about yourself when you think about the views you have of yourself, the views you have of someone else, your family members, your friends, the views you have maybe of some equipment you own or some processes you have in your business. A lot of that is tied up in and can be explained as a narrative, as a story. Certainly we use a lot in decision making and in relationship building. There's no question the stories go a long ways towards relationship building, and psychologists have examined that pretty extensively. Narrative transportation theory is one of the theories they've come up with to say, well, why does this work? Narrative transportation theory kind of postulates that when we hear a story, we're kind of transported to that story world. And I'm sure if you've read a good novel or you've been to a good movie, you've been there, right? You're all tight. Someone comes up and taps you on the shoulder in the middle of a good movie, you're like, oh, you throw your popcorn 3 feet in the air, right? Because all your senses are focused on that movie, and you're wrapped up in it, and you're there with the hero with your sword trying to win the day, right? Save the damsel, right? And so this causes us, when we hear a story, to have less cognitive resistance to what it's telling. One of the interesting things I found, it's just absolutely astonishing. I was doing some research, I don't even remember what on, but I was looking at the population statistics of New Zealand, which is a little island, of course, with about 4 million inhabitants roughly, which is a little more people than there are in Arkansas. And they have, ethnicities and religions and all this different stuff about it. And I noticed one of the religions was Jedi religion, 50,000 people. I'm like, well, apparently that is some Eastern religion or something I just don't happen to have ever heard of. But no, it turns out these people are followers of the chivalry code of Yoda and his colleagues. I'm like, that is just astonishing to me. This shows you why Jesus used parables, all right? This stuff is convincing in a way that kind of is astonishing. 50,000 people who sat in the Star Wars movie and said, yeah, this is me, this is my life, this is my self-image. I'm like Yoda. Yoda is my guy. And I to this day, that amazes me. Some of the things that management people have said about storytelling is they looked at organizations and they said essentially organizations are their narrative. Think about America for a minute, and the feelings and the thoughts you have about America and the stuff you learned from your grandpa talking about the Second World War and your history teacher in high school and other people you've heard speaking, Ronald Reagan and all these people, all these feelings and ideas and stuff you have about America. America is really a narrative. Right? And if we all got up tomorrow morning and said, nah, there's no such thing as America, guess what? There wouldn't be any such thing as America, right? So a lot of people who examine organizations have said, look, your organization is your narrative, the story of who you are, where you've come from, how you got here, and where you're going. That's what your organization is. Leadership and change management are big parts of that. Why am I the legitimate leader of this organization? Where am I taking this? In change management, where have we been? Where are we now? And why do we have to get to a new future story that I'm trying to project through? And that new future story, that's essentially your goals and where you're going to extract your goals from, of where we're going to go. And that's one of the differences between the way managers use stories and the way salespeople or marketers use stories. Managers are trying to, this ideal and this value system, and it's one big story, and it just keeps evolving and molding over time, and it's retold and retold and retold. Well, when you and I go out into a sales setting, that's not what we do, right? That's not the kind of story. We might tell a little chunk off of a story like that to try and impress somebody with what our organization is like. But mostly we're talking about our vacation or this product, how we saw it succeed over here, or those types of stories. Right? So we do a little less of the who we are and how we do things here at Smith & Company than the pure management people do. In marketing, kind of a similar idea to the organization is, what is a brand if it isn't a narrative? If a brand isn't a story, what is it? Think about Harley Davidson. You think about the old motorcycle movies, Steve McQueen, right? was hard. Those are the kind of things that come to mind. And that maybe your grandpa had one, or you knew somebody that had one. The stories you've heard about the Hell's Angels or whatever. That's what kind of what Harley did. And companies that are, and Coca-Cola, think about Coca. Microsoft is a much more recently generated brand. You know, it's all tied up in the whole Steve Jobs thing and how they're so innovative and cutting edge. So in a lot of ways, certainly brand equals story. Advertising, what percentage of advertising, guess what percentage of advertising, I don't know the answer to this. What percentage of advertisements are stories? 60, 70, I don't know, big, a lot. And pretty much, so advertising almost equals story for the most part. We're either visually seeing it, someone using the product and enjoying it. I mean, that's what beer commercials are. There's no maybe words at all, just, you know, Budweiser at the end, you know. But in the middle, there's the guy who walks into the bar and 6 gorgeous babes come up beside him and they've all got a Budweiser. You know, they're telling you a big story. You understand exactly what the story is instead of word, right? Budweiser makes you sexy. That's the story they're telling you. Right? Well, and after 6 or 8 of them, you feel really sexy. No one else is finding you that way. Right? So what about then in sales? Well, we've already said we tend to tell very short stories in sales, very terse. Maybe about what I did on vacation last year, what I plan to do on vacation this year, what this product did for someone else just like you over here, what this product could do for you in the future. Those kind of things are the kind of things that we talk about when we're setting and talking. They don't tend to be the highly repeated, iconic stories of managing people. Right? They tend to be very much more focused on the here and now, very contextually dependent, set in the very much here, very much crafted for the individual person that I happen to be talking to, and their values, their expectations, their needs, etc. That kind of stuff. When I started to do research, actual field research on storytelling by salespeople, I got a medium-sized industrial manufacturer to cooperate with us. And so I talked to all their buyers, their in-house buyers, all their salespeople, and did interviews. Then I went to a smaller firm, a little wholesaler and retailer type of commercial firm, and interviewed their people. They had fewer people, of course, as a small company. And then I did a couple of ride-alongs. So you get in the car with a salesperson, we just go visit customers. So about 49 people were involved in the research, and they were mostly, probably a few more buyers than sales, and a few sales managers shown there too. So some themes that fell out of this observation was just stories are powerful tools. You know, when we started out, we're like, well, how exactly does stories fit in sales? You know, we have our own personal thoughts, but those are anecdotal, right? And so this kind of demonstrates to us, yeah, these salespeople are telling a lot of stories. They know they're telling. Buyers, interestingly, buyers tell a lot of stories. They don't know it. When someone comes in to sell you something, and you start saying, well, this happened, and this happened, and now we've got a problem. You've just told a story. Whereas the salespeople knew they were telling stories, and were doing it somewhat strategically, buyers had no clue. They were telling stories constantly. Almost every time they talked about a need or a problem, they were telling a story. Almost every time a salesperson talked about a solution, they were telling a story. They didn't. Salespeople usually knew it. Buyers almost never. And so that was a key element. So we found the stories can be very persuasive. Buyers find them persuasive. They find them, just like we said, the truth meter is set to true. Unless there's a good reason to disbelieve your story. And let's face it, the persuasion knowledge model says, yeah, we're salespeople, we're in there trying to persuade you. Could be a problem here. There could be some manipulation going on. That could knock the old story truth meter back to untrue, right? But in general, that was found to be a very, very persuasive form and good for building relationships. One of the best things that we discovered that I didn't think of a priori was that when we have a problem at a customer, one of the best things we can do is go in and relate Now you got to be careful because when you use the word story, sometimes story carries the word, I'm trying to make an excuse. But if we craft the story properly, we say, oh, okay, I see why this happened. And the best kind of story is one that says, and because of this problem won't happen again. That's the kind of story we make and use to forestall future problems. Another interesting aspect was that sellers and buyers kind of disagree on whether the personal relationship is more important or the business relationship. What do you think salespeople thought? Personal or business?
Personal.
Almost to a person. What do you think buyers thought?
Business.
Almost to a person. Does that seem like a problem? That's a problem. Okay. I know what I tell people is quit sitting in the office on that first engagement, desperately looking for a picture of a soccer team or a baseball trophy, or so you can make some kind of connection, and give this person a story that says, here is the economic rationale why you should be doing business with me. You didn't come there to make a new friend. They didn't invite you there because they were lonely. They want to know the economic rationale. Tell them a story that says, you should do business with me because of fill in the blank. Stories need to be relevant to the buyer. If I'm a medium-sized firm, I'm the founder, that can be a very compelling story to a similar type of firm, right? If I have a product that was a solution at GM, but now I'm talking to the local shop here, maybe not so much, right? So relevancy is very important, keeping it relevant to the buyer. What about those icebreaker stories we just talked about, where you're going in there and you say, oh, your kids play soccer too? Isn't that unbelievable? Well, every kid in the galaxy plays soccer until they're 12 years old these days, so it's probably not that unbelievable. But at least it is. Well, some little way, yes, buyers know what it's doing. One salesperson told me, yeah, it's a game. Everybody knows it, but we play it and we all go along. So as long as icebreaker stories don't get out of control, as long as that's not your main sales technique, you're going to be okay. Use them a little bit, move on to the important economic rationale. Storytelling quality and ability, most people really didn't think it was that crucial. Does that surprise you? Most people would say, well, okay, I mean, maybe not a great storyteller, but it's okay, I'll listen to this story anyway. It's not a problem. There is a hint, and it's something we have to examine more in future research, but there's a hint that if you're really, really good at storytelling, then maybe, yeah, there is a substantially heightened effect. But there's probably a big zone there in the middle where if you're just okay at telling stories, you're probably going to. Finally, storytelling can have negative effects. Anybody, how many of you have been in front of a salesperson trying to buy something, a car, insurance, whatever, and the salesperson told you a story and you did not want to hear it? Most of you. When we ask that question, somewhere around 2/3 of people say, oh yeah. And probably the bulk of those falls in predictable sex, religion, and politics, right? For the most part, just shut up about that stuff until you really know this person very well, right? Stay away from that. I had an insurance salesman not long ago. I was talking to him about health insurance when I was a grad student, and he started, of course he owned the same health insurance, and he started telling me some very personal health problems his wife had had. I'm like, my God, if she was here, she would kill you. You know, I can't believe how embarrassing this story is for us. That's the kind of stuff you've got to have a little bit of develop judgment and sensitivity to stay away from. So that's about all I've got, but I do want to give you just a minute to ask me any questions. I really appreciate it. It's been a great audience. I really enjoyed it. Guys, would you all like to sign up for my class next semester? It's fantastic.
Well, I believe that body language has a lot to do with storytelling, and basically bodies talk and people listen. So what did you find in your research about body language? Because you've been stippling the whole time, and so to project that you're an expert in this area. So what did you find in your language?
Too much like a preacher. There's a whole. Actually, there is a literature on that in the scientific and practitioner literature on that, and I consider it a separate literature. Do they combine together? Sure they do. Sure they do. But as far as am I an expert in that area, I would say, from an academic perspective, no. But you're absolutely right. I mean, nonverbal. I tell my students, look, you'll read this. There's this old research that says 70% of communication is nonverbal, and if that was true, we could not communicate over the telephone, right? But it's important, but probably a separate issue from storytelling.
So have you done any research on the capacity for someone to hear a story, what the optimum time is to tell one?
Lengthwise?
Yeah.
As far as like speechifying, the thing I tell my students, and I try to practice in class, and I tried to practice it here today, don't go more than 6 minutes. I can watch my students. At 6 minutes, I start to lose 1 or 2. 8 minutes, 3 or 4 are down. 10 minutes, they're all slobbering on themselves. If you go more than about 6 minutes, and there's some scientific research to back that particular number up, you're going pretty long without asking a question, interjecting, letting them get their head going in a different direction somehow. So I would say, as far as the kind of stories I'm talking about, you know, I'm sitting just talking to you. If I went on for 6 minutes on a story, that would be a long story. I'm thinking most stories that are told interpersonally probably last less than a minute or 2. I'm leaving my wife out of that calculation.
And she would be mad if she
Yeah. We will celebrate our 30th anniversary in May.
because she didn't hear you say that.
And yes, exactly, because I'm smart enough to keep it